France just lost West Africa. Not in a war, not in a summit, not with a single headline. It lost it quietly, through 3 landlocked nations that rewrote the rules of power without firing a single shot. Ivory Coast, Paris's most loyal African anchor, is now hemorrhaging the one thing that made it untouchable: its stranglehold over Sahel trade. And the man who engineered this? Not a Western general, not a global superpower, a military junta that the entire world told to stand down. This is not a regional dispute. This is the slow-motion collapse of 60 years of French control. And nobody saw it coming. Ivory Coast just lost something it may never get back. Not territory, not soldiers, not a diplomatic alliance severed in a single dramatic summit. What Abidjan is losing is something far more structural, far more damaging, and far harder to reverse: its position as the irreplaceable gateway to the Sahel. And the most consequential part of the story is that nobody declared war to make it happen. This is the story of how 3 landlocked, coup-led nations, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, quietly dismantled one of West Africa's most durable economic dependencies, and in doing so, exposed the fragility of a Franco-African order that had defined the region for over 6 decades. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Abidjan actually was. Not just a city, not just a port, but a system. A carefully constructed economic and political architecture that linked coastal power to Sahelian resources and connected both to Paris. For decades, the logic was simple and almost invisible in its efficiency. Goods moving in and out of landlocked Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger had to pass through West African ports. And of those ports, Abidjan, the commercial capital of Ivory Coast, was dominant. It was not merely convenient. It was, for all practical purposes, unavoidable. This arrangement was never purely economic. It was geopolitical infrastructure. France understood this. Ivory Coast's ruling class understood this. And the leaders who came and went across the Sahel, regardless of ideology, understood that their access to global markets ran through a coastal choke point over which they had no sovereignty and limited leverage. For Francafrique, the informal network of political, military, and financial influence that France built across its former African colonies, this dependency was a feature, not a bug. It kept peripheral states tethered to coastal ones, coastal states tethered to Paris, and Paris positioned as the silent guarantor of a stability that served, above all, French strategic interests. Then came the coups. And then came the Alliance of Sahel States. Between 2021 and 2023, military juntas seized power in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in rapid succession. Western governments condemned each transition. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, threatened sanctions, and in the case of Niger in 2023, openly discussed the possibility of military intervention to restore the deposed President Mohamed Bazoum. The rhetoric from Abidjan was among the strongest in the region. Ivory Coast, under President Alassane Ouattara, positioned itself firmly on the side of the interventionist camp, echoing Western demands for constitutional restoration and aligning closely with France's hardening posture toward the juntas. From the outside, this looked like the logical position for a country that had prospered within the Western-aligned order. What it actually was, in hindsight, was a strategic overcommitment. Abidjan announced to the Sahel states loudly and clearly whose side it was on. And the Sahel states, now organized as the AES, the Alliance des États du Sahel, heard the message. This is where the story becomes geopolitically extraordinary. Because what the AES chose to do in response was not military confrontation. It was not a severing of ties through any dramatic diplomatic rupture. What it did was quieter, more deliberate, and arguably more effective. It began rerouting. Trade that had historically flowed through Abidjan's port began shifting. Togo's port of Lomé, smaller, less dominant, but geographically positioned and politically neutral in the eyes of the juntas, began receiving increased attention. Infrastructure investments followed. Diplomatic courtship followed. And critically, the AES states began framing this not as a rejection of coastal trade routes per se, but as a strategic diversification, a reassertion of economic sovereignty that did not need the blessing or the infrastructure of those who had aligned against them. Pause here and consider what this signals. These are three of the poorest nations on earth. Nations with ongoing counterinsurgency campaigns against jihadist movements. Nations under varying degrees of international sanctions and diplomatic pressure. And yet they had enough economic leverage, enough combined trade volume, to meaningfully shift port traffic away from the region's historically dominant hub. That is not a small thing. That is a demonstration of structural power that most Western analysts did not account for. The AES was not just reordering logistics. It was sending a message. The message was this: coastal states that align themselves against Sahelian sovereignty will pay an economic price. And that price will compound over time. Simultaneously, the AES was doing something else that directly undermined France's regional position. It was building new relationships. Russia's Wagner Group, rebranded and restructured under the Russian state umbrella as Africa Corps, had already established a significant presence in Mali. Burkina Faso followed. Niger, after expelling French forces in 2023, began exploring similar arrangements. This was not ideology for its own sake. The juntas were pragmatic operators, not committed ideologues of any particular camp. What Russia offered was security assistance without the conditionality, without the democracy clauses, the governance benchmarks, the implicit threats to pull support if elections were delayed or opposition figures were arrested. For leaders governing by decree in the middle of active insurgencies, that was a compelling offer. But Russia was not alone. Turkey expanded its diplomatic and commercial footprint across the region, leveraging its Bosphorus-spanning identity as a Muslim-majority NATO member with post-colonial credibility that neither France nor the United States could claim. Chinese infrastructure financing, long present in Africa in various forms, found even more receptive interlocutors in governments that had explicitly declared their interest in alternatives to Western-led development frameworks. The AES, in short, was not simply rejecting France. It was constructing an alternative architecture, one built on diversified partnerships, distributed leverage, and strategic ambiguity. For France, the timing could not have been worse. Paris had already been navigating an extraordinarily difficult period in its African policy. The withdrawal from Mali in 2022, following years of operational frustration and growing hostility toward the French military presence, was a significant blow to French strategic credibility. The subsequent expulsion from Burkina Faso and then Niger stripped France of its Sahelian forward operating network almost entirely. Operation Barkhane, France's signature counterterrorism campaign in the region, had effectively collapsed. The political investment, the military casualties, the financial cost, the decade-long commitment to stabilizing the Sahel, all of it had yielded a situation where France was less welcome in the region than at any point since decolonization. Against this backdrop, France began what its officials carefully described as a recalibration of its Africa strategy. Military footprints were being reduced. Basing agreements were being renegotiated or terminated. The tone of French diplomatic engagement shifted slightly, sometimes awkwardly, toward acknowledging African agency and reducing the paternalistic framing that had long characterized Paris's continental posture. But for countries like Ivory Coast that had built their regional strategy around proximity to France, this recalibration created a new and uncomfortable reality. The security guarantees that underwrote Abidjan's confidence were quietly being walked back. The partnership that had seemed permanent was revealing its conditionality. What once appeared to be an unshakable proxy alignment is now being described, with increasing bluntness, as a strategic miscalculation. Ivory Coast positioned itself as the Western camp's anchor in coastal West Africa at the precise moment that the Western camp was retreating. It hardened its posture toward the AES states at the precise moment those states were demonstrating the economic leverage to punish that hardening. And it did all of this while France's military umbrella was folding. This is where the stakes become genuinely structural. Because Abidjan's challenge is not just about port revenues or diplomatic optics. It's about the future of its entire regional model. Ivory Coast prosperity, real, substantial prosperity, built on cocoa, finance, services, and trade, has historically been inseparable from its position as the region's economic hub. The country's stability, its growth trajectory, its ability to attract foreign investment, all of it rests on the premise that Abidjan is where West Africa's commerce flows. Undermine that premise, and you undermine the entire architecture of Ivorian economic power. The AES's trade redirection is not yet catastrophic in absolute terms. Lomé has grown, but it has not yet replaced Abidjan. The Ivorian economy remains robust by regional standards. But trajectories matter. Trends matter. The direction of movement matters. And the direction of movement right now is away from Abidjan, not toward it. Every infrastructure investment that Togo makes in its port capacity is an investment in a future where Sahelian trade flows through Lomé rather than through Abidjan. Every diplomatic relationship that the AES builds with powers outside the French sphere is a relationship that does not need Ivory Coast as an intermediary. Is this the beginning of a permanent restructuring of West African trade geography, or a temporary disruption that a political recalibration could reverse? That question is genuinely open, but the window for Abidjan to answer it is narrowing. There is a broader conceptual shift happening here that deserves careful attention. The AES has not simply moved cargo from one port to another. It has offered a new theory of sovereignty for the Sahel, and by extension, for a significant portion of Francophone Africa. That theory runs roughly as follows. The arrangement that kept landlocked nations dependent on coastal ones, and coastal ones dependent on France, was never neutral. It was a design that extracted resources, kept political elites in line, and insulated the whole system from the kind of bottom-up accountability that might have threatened it. The coups in this framing are not just military takeovers. They are the first act of a genuine decolonization that the formal independence of the 1960s never actually delivered. You do not have to agree with that framing to recognize its political potency. Across West Africa, including in countries that have not had coups, polling and social media data consistently show deep skepticism of France and significant sympathy for the AES's rhetoric of sovereignty. The juntas are authoritarian. Their human rights records are troubling. Their management of the actual security crises in their countries is, by most credible assessments, not significantly better than what preceded them. And yet they command a kind of Pan-African nationalist sentiment that civilian governments aligned with France struggle to counter. Because the sentiment is not really about the juntas. It is about the underlying structure of dependency that the juntas, whatever their faults, are at least rhetorically and operationally challenging. For Ivory Coast, this creates a political dilemma that sits beneath the economic one. President Ouattara is 83 years old, with a complicated political legacy and an elite coalition that has long defined itself in opposition to the kind of radical nationalist politics now ascendant in the Sahel. His government cannot easily adopt the AES's rhetorical framework without undermining the foundations of its own legitimacy. It cannot suddenly reframe its relationship with France as a problem to be solved without alienating the business and political elite whose interests are deeply intertwined with the Paris connection. But it also cannot simply continue as though the regional environment has not changed, because the regional environment has changed profoundly. This is the dilemma of a country that built its identity around being the region's model of Western-aligned stability, at a moment when Western alignment in Africa is becoming a liability rather than an asset in significant parts of the region's political landscape. What happens to Ivory Coast's relationship with the AES states over the next 5 years is one of the most consequential questions in West African geopolitics. If Abidjan finds a way to recalibrate, to distance itself sufficiently from the most aggressive interventionist rhetoric, to offer the Sahel states something they need without demanding political alignment in return, to position itself as an economic partner rather than a political adversary, it is possible that some of the trade flows currently redirecting toward Togo could be recovered. Lomé, for all its growing relevance, does not yet have Abidjan's depth of financial services, logistics infrastructure, or connectivity to global markets. There is a real argument that Ivory Coast has inherent geographic and infrastructural advantages that politics alone cannot permanently override. But that scenario requires Abidjan to make moves that would involve real political costs. It would mean implicitly accepting that its alignment with the interventionist camp over Niger was a mistake. It would mean engaging with governments that Paris is still, at least formally, opposed to. It would mean charting a degree of independent regional policy that Ivorian foreign policy has rarely attempted. Whether the current leadership has the political will and the remaining time to execute such a pivot is genuinely uncertain. Meanwhile, the AES is not standing still. The formation of the confederation, moving from the loose Alliance of Sahel States toward a more formally structured confederation of Sahel States with unified currency discussions, joint security architecture, and coordinated foreign policy, represents an attempt to institutionalize the rupture. If that institutionalization succeeds, if the AES becomes a durable regional bloc with its own economic logic and its own diplomatic identity, then the question for Ivory Coast is not whether it can recover its old position. That position may simply cease to exist. The question becomes what role Abidjan can play in a West Africa reorganized around different axes of power. The implications extend well beyond Ivory Coast. France is watching this dynamic with an anxiety that its diplomatic language carefully does not fully express. Paris retains significant economic interests in Ivory Coast, in banking, in telecoms, in the cocoa sector, in infrastructure financing. The CFA franc system, for all the criticism it has attracted, still ties Francophone West African monetary policy to the French treasury in ways that Paris values enormously. Ivory Coast is the anchor of that system. If Abidjan's regional position erodes, if its economic model weakens, if its political stability comes under pressure from the combined effects of regional isolation and internal generational discontent, the entire architecture of French economic influence in West Africa starts to buckle. For Russia, Turkey, and China, the ongoing strain between Abidjan and the AES is, by contrast, an opportunity. Not necessarily an opportunity to be actively exploited through aggressive diplomatic intervention. These relationships are more subtle than that. But an opportunity created by a vacuum. Every degree to which France's informal empire in West Africa weakens creates space for alternative relationships to deepen. The AES states have already demonstrated that this space can be filled. And the more credibly they demonstrate it, the more other states, including those that have not yet experienced coups, begin to recalibrate their own options. Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria, all of them are watching. All of them are managing their own domestic political pressures around the question of sovereignty, dependency, and what it means to be genuinely non-aligned in 2024 and 2025. None of them are rushing to join the AES, but none of them are immune to its political gravity either. The rupture between France and the Sahel states, the trade rerouting away from Abidjan, the construction of an AES identity around sovereignty and diversified alliances. These are not isolated events. They are data points in a larger reconfiguration of who holds power in West Africa, and through what mechanisms. The era in which coastal states could reliably count on their position as landlocked nations' gateways, and could leverage that position to maintain alignment with distant metropolitan powers, is visibly ending. What replaces it is not yet fully formed. The AES may consolidate or it may fracture. The juntas may prove durable or they may fall. Togo's port may continue its rise, or it may hit geographic and logistical limits. France may find a way to re-enter the Sahel through softer means, or its influence may continue its structural decline. None of this is predetermined. Geopolitics rarely unfolds in clean narratives. But the direction of travel is clear. And Ivory Coast, sitting at the intersection of all these pressures, economically exposed, politically constrained, regionally isolated from its northern neighbors, and diplomatically anchored to a patron whose regional power is fading, faces a reckoning that its political class has not yet fully acknowledged publicly. The question that should be keeping Abidjan's strategists awake is not how to defend the old order. It is whether Ivory Coast can find a new identity in a West Africa that is reorganizing itself around principles, sovereignty, multipolarity, resource control, that directly challenge the foundations on which Ivorian regional prominence was built. What that identity looks like, and whether Ivory Coast leadership has the vision and the political courage to build it, will determine whether Abidjan remains a capital of regional consequence or becomes a cautionary tale about the cost of betting too confidently on a patron whose time in West Africa is running out. The Sahel has moved. The question is whether the coast can adapt or whether it will be left behind by a West Africa it no longer fully recognizes. Here is what history will record about this moment. Not the coups, not the expulsions, not the sanctions or the summits or the strongly worded statements from Paris. What history will record is something quieter and far more permanent. The moment West Africa stopped asking for permission. The Alliance of Sahel States did not defeat France in any conventional sense. There were no battles, no dramatic treaty signings, no single moment of rupture that cameras captured. What happened was structural, methodical, almost invisible until it was already irreversible. Three nations, poor by every metric the Western financial system uses to measure power, looked at the architecture of their dependency and began dismantling it piece by piece, port by port, partnership by partnership. And Ivory Coast, the jewel of Francafrique, the model the West pointed to when it needed proof that alignment with Paris produced prosperity. Ivory Coast is now sitting in the wreckage of a bet it did not fully realize it was making. This is the brutal logic of geopolitical transition. It does not wait for you to adapt. It does not announce itself with courtesy. It simply moves. And those who built their entire regional identity around a structure that is collapsing do not get a graceful exit. They get a reckoning. France is not finished in Africa. Let that be said clearly. French capital, French banking networks, French language, French cultural presence. None of that disappears overnight. But French strategic primacy, the ability to set the terms, pick the leaders, protect the loyalists, and punish the dissenters, that is gone from the Sahel. And its erosion along the coast has already begun. The deeper question, the one that matters beyond today's headlines and this year's trade statistics, is whether what replaces the old order will actually serve the people of this region better. The juntas are not liberators. The Russian presence is not philanthropy. The diversified partnerships being constructed across the Sahel carry their own dependencies, their own conditionalities, their own risks. Sovereignty is not the same as prosperity, and reordering who extracts the value is not the same as ensuring the value stays home. That tension between the legitimate demand for genuine self-determination and the hard reality that new patrons can replicate old structures under different flags is the unresolved question at the heart of everything happening in West Africa right now. What is not in question is this: the map has changed. The leverage has shifted. The rules are being rewritten. And the nations, the leaders, and the powers that understand this new map will shape what West Africa becomes. Those that don't, those that keep navigating by the old coordinates, will find themselves increasingly lost in a region they thought they knew. The Sahel moved first. The coast is next. And the world is watching to see who blinks. This is not the end of West Africa's story. It is the end of one chapter, and the beginning of something none of us can fully predict yet.